Some stories are written in ink, others in blood. What if you found a diary, not filled with teenage angst or secret loves, but with the unfiltered confessions of a monster? A step-by-step account of a mind spiraling into darkness, chronicling a descent into madness and murder, all in the killer's own, chilling words. Tonight, we don't just tell a story, we unseal a testament. But before we turn the first bloodstained page, do yourself a favor and click that subscribe button. You'll want to be part of our community when the lights go out. Trust me. Now take a deep breath. What you are about to read is not for the faint of heart. The bookstore smelled of decaying paper and forgotten promises, a scent Leo found more comforting than any perfume. For 10 years, the dusty shelf had been his sanctuary, a quiet haven from a world that had always felt too loud, too fast. He was a curator of other people's stories, a custodian of abandoned worlds bound in leather and cardboard. His own story was a simple one, written in quiet routines and the gentle rustle of turning pages. That was until the arrival of the Carlisle estate. The donation had been a massive one, the entire library of a reclusive academic named Alastair Finch, who had recently passed away. Boxes upon boxes of scholarly texts, first edition classics, and esoteric philosophy filled the back room. It was during the third day of sorting through this mountain of literature that Leo found it. It wasn't on a shelf or packed neatly with the other volumes. It was at the very bottom of a crate filled with miscellaneous papers, old photographs, and assorted junk, as if it had been discarded or hidden. It was a simple diary, bound in dark, unadorned leather, the kind one might find in any stationery shop. It was worn at the edges, the leather supple from years of handling. There was no name, no title, just a single, dark stain near the spine that had soaked deep into the cover, stiffening the leather. It had the coppery, metallic scent of old iron or dried blood. Leo, ever the pragmatist, dismissed it as a wine or ink stain and, his curiosity piqued, set it aside to look at later. That night, in the quiet solitude of his small apartment, with the rain drumming a gentle rhythm against the window pane, he opened the diary. The paper was thick and creamy, the handwriting an elegant, almost calligraphic script that was at odds with the chaotic energy of the words themselves. The first entry was dated 5 years prior. October 12th, they call it the sanctity of life. A fragile, precious thing. I call it a canvas of flesh and bone, of sinew and soul, waiting for an artist's touch. The world is filled with unfinished sculptures, imperfect paintings, people who drift through existence without purpose, their lives a messy, uninspired scrawl. They are blank pages. I have decided to provide the ink. I will be the editor of their stories, and I will write them a final, perfect chapter. The city is my gallery, and I am ready to begin my exhibition. Leo sat back, a small, amused smile on his face. It was dramatic, certainly, probably the work of a frustrated writer, an angsty student of philosophy who had read too much Nietzsche. He'd seen dozens of such journals over the years. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and continued reading. The entries for the next few months were philosophical, arrogant, filled with musings on mortality and the nature of art. The author referred to himself only as the artisan. He wrote about stalking the canvases of the city, studying their routines, their flaws, their pathetic, mundane lives. He described the thrill of walking among them, a god in mortal disguise, holding the secret of their final punctuation mark in his hands. It was creepy, yes, but still felt like a work of fiction, a well-written but ultimately harmless fantasy. Then came the entry from January 4th. The tone shifted. The philosophical detachment was gone, replaced by a feverish, almost euphoric excitement. January 4th, tonight, the ink flowed. My first piece is complete. I have titled it The Banker's Final Withdrawal. His name was Martin Gable, a man whose soul was as gray as his suit. He worshipped at the altar of commerce, his life a tedious ledger of profit and loss. I followed him for weeks. I learned his predictable orbit. Office, overpriced restaurant, empty penthouse overlooking a city he owned but did not see. I chose the alley behind his favorite restaurant. a place reeking of garbage and regret. It was a fitting studio. He was surprised, of course. The fear in his eyes was exquisite, a raw, primal emotion that his sterile life had never allowed him to feel. I used a garrote. It is a clean, intimate tool. It requires strength, precision, and a certain connection with the subject. As the life drained from him, I saw it. The moment of clarity. The moment he understood the absolute meaninglessness of his existence. In his final, silent scream, he became art. His body, slumped against the grimy brickwork, was a masterpiece of stillness, a sculpture of consequence. They will find him in the morning. They will call it a robbery gone wrong. They will never understand the aestheticism of the act. Leo's blood ran cold. The detail was so specific. Martin Gable. The name pricked at his memory. He put the diary down, his hands trembling slightly, and walked over to his laptop. With a sense of dread coiling in his stomach, he typed Martin Gable, death, into the search bar. The screen filled with articles from 4.5 years ago. Prominent city banker found dead. Police suspect mugging in tragic death of financier Martin Gable. The article mentioned the location, an alleyway behind La Serafina, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. The cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. The case was still unsolved. Leo felt the whiskey sour in his stomach. This couldn't be real. It had to be a coincidence. A twisted writer who had based his fiction on a real-life tragedy. It was the only logical explanation. But as he read on, the coincidences began to pile up, forming a mountain of irrefutable, horrifying truth. Each masterpiece, described in the diary, was a detailed confession to an unsolved murder or a mysterious disappearance that had plagued the city over the past 5 years. There was the librarian's last chapter, a woman named Evelyn Reed, who had vanished without a trace. The diary described her as a collector of forgotten stories and confessed to burying her beneath the floorboards of a derelict library, her body becoming one of the forgotten stories she so loved. Leo remembered the case. The library had been demolished a year later to make way for a new condominium complex. Her body would never be found. There was the florist's wilted bloom, a young woman whose death had been ruled an accidental drowning. The diary described a meticulous, horrifying process of holding her head under the water of her own flower-soaking basin, surrounded by the beautiful, silent witnesses of her own merchandise. The author wrote of the poetic justice, the beauty of her dark hair fanning out like seaweed amongst the lily stems. The entries were a cocktail of artistic pretension and brutal, clinical detail. The artisan described his methods, his choice of victims, his philosophy. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a liberator, an artist who was granting his subjects a final, meaningful moment in their otherwise meaningless lives. He was a collector of last breaths, a connoisseur of final heartbeats. Leo read for hours, the world outside his apartment fading away. The rain stopped, the sun rose, but he was oblivious. He was trapped in the diary, a prisoner of its blood-stained pages. He felt a sickening intimacy with the author, as if he were sitting beside him, watching him write, the scent of blood and ink mingling in the air. He knew the killer's thoughts, his frustrations, his triumphs. He knew that the artisan hated the color yellow, that he believed the sound of a violin was the closest thing to a human soul in distress, that he found a strange beauty in the intricate patterns of a spider's web. The final entry in the diary was dated 6 months ago. It was shorter than the others, and the handwriting was less controlled, more erratic. April 22nd, the gallery grows quiet. The canvases have become predictable. The thrill of the creation is waning. I feel a creative ennui, a spiritual exhaustion. My work requires a witness, an audience. Art is meaningless without an eye to behold it, a mind to comprehend its terrible beauty. A performance is incomplete without an ovation. I fear I am becoming just another forgotten story, my masterpieces gathering dust in the cold, sterile archives of unsolved case files. This cannot be. A new project is required. A final, interactive piece. A performance that will live on, even after the artist has taken his final bow. The diary is almost full. It is time for it to find its curator. Leo slammed the book shut, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. The last entry was a clear, unambiguous statement of intent. The diary hadn't been lost or discarded. It had been planted. The reclusive academic, Alistair Finch, was he the artisan? Had he died of natural causes, leaving his dark secret to be discovered? Or was he still out there, the diary a baited hook cast into the sea of anonymity, waiting for someone like Leo to bite? He looked at the dark stain on the cover, and a new, horrifying thought entered his mind. He had assumed it was old, but the coppery scent was so distinct. He stood up and walked to the kitchen, his movements stiff and robotic. He took a bottle of hydrogen peroxide from the medicine cabinet. He returned to the living room, his mind a maelstrom of fear and morbid curiosity. With a trembling hand, he poured a single drop of the clear liquid onto the dark stain. It fizzed. A small white foam erupted on the surface of the leather, a chemical reaction that confirmed his deepest, most primal fear. The stain wasn't ink. It wasn't wine. It was blood. And it wasn't old. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The artisan was still out there. And the diary, this blood-stained confession of a killer, was not an ending. It was an invitation to a private exhibition. And Leo, the quiet, unassuming curator of the dusty shelf, had just become its sole terrified attendee. The silence of his apartment was no longer comforting. It was the silence of a gallery, and he had the distinct, horrifying feeling that he was no longer just the audience. He was the final exhibit. Sleep, when it finally came, was a battlefield. Leo's dreams were a chaotic gallery curated by the artisan. He walked through alleys of grimy brick where slumped shadows wore the faces of his customers. He swam in basins filled with lilies and floating hair. He felt the phantom pressure of a garrote on his neck, the rough texture of old floorboards beneath his fingernails. He woke up with a gasp. The elegant, insane script of the diary burned onto the backs of his eyelids. The apartment, once his sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its familiar shadows twisting into menacing shapes. The diary sat on his coffee table, a malevolent presence. He couldn't bring himself to touch it, yet he couldn't bear to be in another room. It was a lodestone of horror, and he was hopelessly tethered to its gravitational pull. His first rational thought was to go to the police. It was the sane, logical thing to do. He even rehearsed the conversation in his head. "Hello, officer. I found this diary. I think it's the confession of a serial killer who calls himself the artisan. Yes, I know it sounds like a bad movie plot. No, I don't know who wrote it. It was in a box of books from a dead academic. Oh, and I performed a chemical test on the cover. Yes, with hydrogen peroxide from my bathroom. No, I don't have any other proof." He could hear the skepticism in their voices, see the weary, dismissive looks. They would think he was a crank, a fame-seeker, or worse. They might even suspect him. His fingerprints were all over the diary. How could he explain the intimate knowledge he now possessed of the city's most gruesome unsolved crimes? The diary was an accusation, and by possessing it, he felt as though the guilt had somehow leached into his own skin. Fear, cold and sharp, was quickly followed by a strange, morbid compulsion. The artisan had called for a curator. He had chosen Leo, whether by chance or by some terrifying design. The thought was both repulsive and, in a dark corner of his soul he didn't know existed, strangely compelling. He was the only person in the world who knew the truth. He was the sole audience to a series of monstrous performances. To hand the diary over would be to relinquish that unique, terrifying position. It felt like a betrayal not of the killer, but of the story itself. He spent the next few days in a fog of paranoia. At the bookstore, every customer was a potential suspect. The quiet old man browsing the history section, the intense young student in the philosophy aisle, the cheerful woman buying a gardening book, they all wore the mask of the artisan. The city, his city, had transformed. The familiar streets were no longer just routes from home to work. They were potential crime scenes, a sprawling gallery of past and future atrocities. An alleyway was no longer just an alleyway. It was the artisan's studio. A quiet park was not a place of peace. It was a hunting ground. The diary drew him back each night. He became obsessed with its contents, rereading the entries until he had them memorized. He was no longer just reading, he was studying. He cross-referenced the dates with old news articles, building a timeline of the artisan's reign of terror. He created a map of the city, marking the locations of each exhibition. Pattern began to emerge. The locations were not random. They were all places of transition, of endings. A library slated for demolition. A flower shop on the verge of bankruptcy. An alley behind a restaurant known for its final meal tasting menus. The artisan was a creature of symbolism, of metaphor. His madness had a chilling, undeniable method. This self-imposed investigation began to take its toll. He stopped answering his phone. He ate little, subsisting on coffee and the nervous energy that thrummed through his veins. When he looked in the mirror, a haunted stranger looked back, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his face pale and drawn. He had become a ghost in his own life, his existence solely defined by the book on his coffee table. One evening, driven by a need to make the words on the page tangible, to connect them to the real world, he made a decision. He would visit one of the sites. He chose the location of the second murder, the poet's final verse. The diary described a man named Samuel Blackwood, a struggling poet who frequented a particular bench in Westminster Park, overlooking the city's melancholic, industrial skyline. The artisan had written of sitting with him, discussing art and mortality, before administering a fast-acting poison in a shared flask of cheap wine, calling it a final, perfect metaphor for his tortured existence. Blackwood's death had been ruled a suicide, a tragic but unsurprising end for a man known for his depressive verse. The park was cloaked in the fading light of dusk as Leo arrived. He found the bench easily, an old, weather-beaten thing with a plaque dedicated to a long-forgotten city councilman. He sat down, the wood cold against his legs. He could almost see them, the killer and the poet, sitting here, their conversation a prelude to a quiet, brutal end. The diary entry had mentioned a specific detail. He was a creature of habit, always carving his initials, SB, into the underside of the bench, a pathetic attempt at immortality. I made sure to leave his final masterpiece untouched. With a trembling hand, Leo knelt down and ran his fingers along the rough, splintered wood on the underside of the bench. And there it was, dozens of overlapping carvings of the letters SB. A desperate, silent scream for recognition. And next to them, almost hidden in the grain of the wood, was another carving. A small, stylized symbol he hadn't noticed in the diary before, a tiny detail in a sketch on a margin. It was a raven holding a key, the crest from the invitation in the previous story. No, that was another story. It was a stylized compass rose, with one point elongated, like a dagger. The artisan's signature. The discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. This was real. This was proof. The police had missed this. He, Leo, the quiet bookseller, had found it. A sense of perverse pride mingled with the fear. He was a better detective than they were. He understood the artisan in a way they never could. He was the curator. It was then that he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He slowly rose to his feet, his heart hammering in his chest. He scanned the park. It was mostly empty now. A couple walking their dog in the distance. A lone jogger on a far path. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling persisted, a cold pressure on the back of his neck. He turned his attention to the trees that bordered the park, their branches dark and skeletal against the twilight sky. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a figure standing in the deep shadows, a silhouette of a man, perfectly still. Leo blinked and the figure was gone. Was it his imagination? Had his paranoia finally conjured a phantom from the depths of his fear? Or had the artisan been there? Had he returned to admire his own handiwork? The thought that the killer knew he was there, that this was all part of the interactive exhibit, was paralyzing. He had walked into the lion's den, a willing participant in a game he didn't understand. He fled the park, his footsteps echoing loudly on the pavement. He didn't look back. The walk home was a journey through a landscape of fear. Every shadow held a threat. Every stranger's glance was an accusation. When he finally reached his apartment, he slammed the door shut and leaned against it, his body trembling. He went straight to the diary, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. He was looking for the compass rose symbol. He found it, tucked away in the corner of a page describing his plans for a future peace. And then he saw something else, something his terrified mind had overlooked before. In the final, frantic entry, beneath the words, "It is time for it to find its curator," was a faint, almost invisible postscript written in pencil. The curator must understand that to observe the art is to become part of the art. The final exhibition will require your attendance. Look for the next blank canvas. The one who sells forgotten promises. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The one who sells forgotten promises. A bookseller. He was talking about Leo. It was not chance. Alastair Finch's library, the hidden diary, it was all a deliberate, meticulous setup. He had been chosen. He had been studied. The artisan knew who he was. The phone rang, its shrill, sudden sound making him cry out in shock. He never got calls this late. He stared at the phone as it rang, his mind racing. It was him. It had to be him. The artisan was calling him. He was breaking the silence, closing the distance between the artist and the curator. With a hand that felt disconnected from his body, Leo picked up the receiver. He held it to his ear, his throat too tight to speak. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then, a voice. A calm, cultured, and terrifyingly gentle voice. "Did you enjoy the park, Leo?" the voice asked. "I do hope my work met with your approval. The exhibition is about to enter its final, most intimate phase. And you, my dear curator, have a front row seat." The line went dead. Leo stood frozen in the middle of his living room, the dial tone a monotonous drone in his ear. The game had changed. He was no longer a secret observer, a silent curator. He was a piece on the board, a key player in the artisan's final, horrifying masterpiece. The diary was no longer just a confession of past crimes. It was a script for his own future. And the final chapter was about to be written. The voice on the phone shattered the last vestiges of Leo's detached reality. The artisan was no longer a phantom confined to the pages of a book. He was a real, breathing entity who knew his name, knew his movements, knew his fear. The line between curator and exhibit had been irrevocably erased. The quiet bookstore, his sanctuary, now felt like the most dangerous place on earth. The forgotten promises he sold had become a macabre prophecy, and he was its terrified fulfillment. For 2 days, Leo lived in a state of suspended terror. He didn't go to work. He didn't answer the door. He sat in his apartment with the curtains drawn, the diary open on the table before him. It was no longer a collection of confessions but a puzzle he had to solve, a blueprint for his own survival. The killer's words, once a source of horrified fascination, were now a lifeline. He scoured every page, every annotation, every doodle in the margins, searching for a clue, for some hint of the artisan's identity or his plan for this final exhibition. He focused on the first owner of the diary, the deceased academic, Alastair Finch. Was he the killer, and had he faked his own death? Or was he another victim, a pawn used to deliver the diary to Leo? Leo searched for Finch's obituary online. He had been a professor of aesthetics and symbology at the local university, a recluse known for his eccentric theories on the relationship between art and mortality. The parallels were too strong to ignore. The obituary mentioned he had no living relatives and had bequeathed his entire library to a local bookstore. It all seemed too neat, too perfectly orchestrated. Driven by a desperate hunch, Leo began researching Finch's academic work. He found essays and papers on esoteric subjects, but one title stood out: The Poetics of Absence, Understanding Art Through What Is Not There. In it, Finch argued that a work of art is often defined by the negative space, the silence between notes, the story that is intentionally omitted. He wrote about artists who created elaborate hoaxes and posthumous works, turning their own lives and deaths into a final, performative piece. It was in this essay that Leo found it. A single footnote referencing a brilliant but troubled former student who had expanded upon these theories in a graduate thesis. The student's name was Julian Croft. Leo's blood turned to ice. Julian Croft. The name was unremarkable, yet it felt like the final key turning in a lock he had been struggling with for days. A quick search revealed that Julian Croft had been Finch's protege and teaching assistant for years. He had dropped out of the PhD program abruptly 5 years ago, right around the time the diary entries began. Another search for Julian Croft address yielded a result. A loft apartment in the city's old warehouse district, an area known for its art galleries and studios. The final exhibition. A gallery. It had to be the place. Panic warred with a strange, grim sense of purpose. He could go to the police now. He had a name, an address, a motive. It was concrete. But the voice on the phone echoed in his mind. You have a front row seat. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. An invitation. If he went to the police, Croft might disappear, the final chapter unwritten, the story incomplete. And a terrifying, irrational part of Leo, the part that had been twisted into the shape of a curator, couldn't bear that. He had to see the art. He had to see the artist. He knew it was madness. He was walking into his own grave. But the alternative, living the rest of his life in the shadow of this story, never knowing the ending, seemed like a different kind of death. He took a taxi to the warehouse district, the diary tucked into a satchel, its weight both a burden and a strange source of courage. The address was a large, nondescript brick building with wide, grimy windows. The ground floor was a trendy art gallery, closed for the night. Croft's loft was likely on one of the upper floors. Leo found a side entrance, the door unlocked. The building's interior was a maze of echoing hallways and steep staircases. He made his way upward, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm in the silence. The third floor was a single, long corridor with only one door at the far end. As he approached, he saw a faint light spilling from underneath it. This was it. He pushed the door open. It was unlocked. The loft was immense, a cavernous space with high ceilings and massive windows that offered a panoramic view of the glittering city lights. But it wasn't the view that stole Leo's breath away. It was the room itself. It was a gallery. His gallery. The space was meticulously arranged into a series of exhibits, each one a horrifying, three-dimensional recreation of a murder from the diary. In one corner, a mannequin in a gray suit was slumped against a section of brick wall, a garrote around its neck. The banker's final withdrawal. In another, a mound of earth was piled on a Persian rug, with a single skeletal arm reaching out, a book clutched in its bony fingers. The librarian's last chapter. There were photographs, newspaper clippings, and even personal items from the victim's locket, a pair of glasses, a book of poetry, all displayed with the cold, sterile precision of a museum exhibit. And in the center of the room, on a large raised platform, was the final exhibition. His exhibition. It was a perfect replica of his own reading chair from his apartment. Next to it was a small table with a whiskey glass and a lamp. And on the floor, surrounding it, were photographs. Dozens of them. Pictures of him. Leo at the bookstore. Leo walking home. Leo sitting in his apartment, reading the diary. Leo kneeling at the park bench. They had been taken from a distance, through his window from across the street. He had been under surveillance for weeks. He hadn't just been chosen. He had been curated. A masterpiece. Wouldn't you agree? The voice came from the shadows. The same calm, cultured voice from the phone. A man stepped into the light. He was of average height and build, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a warm, disarming smile. He looked like a professor, an artist, a man you would pass on the street without a second glance. He was Julian Croft. He was the artisan. The final piece is called The Curator, Croft said, his voice filled with an artist's pride. It explores the relationship between the creator and the observer, the moment when the act of watching becomes an act of participation. Your fear, your obsession, your paranoia. They are the final, perfect brushstrokes. Leo stood frozen, the satchel containing the diary feeling impossibly heavy. Alistair Finch, he managed to whisper. My mentor, Croft said with a nod. He provided the theory. I provided the practice. He was old, unwell. He agreed to be the overture to my symphony. His death, his library, the random discovery of the diary. It was all a carefully composed prologue, designed to lead the perfect audience member to me. And you, Leo, with your love of stories and your quiet, observant nature. You were perfect. You're insane? Leo breathed, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. Is an artist insane for wanting his work to be seen, to be understood? Croft countered, taking a step closer. Those people, they were just canvases, raw material. But you are the gallery. You are the living testament to my work. You are my legacy. He gestured to the replica of Leo's chair. Please, take your seat. The front row as promised. Leo didn't move. He looked around the horrifying gallery, at the macabre trophies of a madman's art. And he knew this was the final choice. He could become the final, silent exhibit, a man broken by a story he was forced to curate. Or he could write his own ending. With a sudden, desperate movement, he reached into his satchel, not for the diary, but for the one thing he had brought with him, a heavy, first-edition copy of Moby Dick he had grabbed from his apartment, its weight a small, solid comfort in his hand. He hurled it with all his might, not at Croft, but at the massive window overlooking the city. The glass exploded outwards in a shower of glittering shards, the sound a deafening roar that shattered the gallery's sanctimonious silence. A cold wind whipped through the room, sending papers and photographs scattering. For a moment, Croft was stunned, his perfect composition ruined. The artist had lost control of his gallery. That single moment was all Leo needed. He didn't run for the door he had entered. He ran for the broken window. He didn't look down. He scrambled onto the ledge, the city a dizzying abyss below him. He saw the fire escape, a few feet to his left. He leaped, his fingers catching the cold, rusted metal, his body swinging violently against the side of the building. He heard Croft shout behind him, a cry of pure, artistic rage. His masterpiece was escaping. Leo scrambled down the fire escape, his hands raw, his lungs burning. He didn't stop until his feet hit the solid pavement of the alley below. He ran, block after block, until the warehouse district was far behind him. He didn't stop until he saw the flashing blue and red lights of a police car. He flagged it down, babbling a frantic, incoherent story about a loft, a gallery of death, and a man named Julian Croft. The aftermath was a blur. The police raided the loft. It was empty. Croft was gone. The entire gallery, every exhibit, every photograph, had vanished, as if it had never existed. The only evidence that Leo hadn't lost his mind was the blood-stained diary, which he had left behind on the floor of the loft, a final, parting gift for the police. They found Croft's fingerprints all over it, matching him to several of the cold cases. A nationwide manhunt was launched for the killer known as the Artisan. Leo was safe, but he was not free. He had been the curator, and now he was the sole exhibit. He had seen the art, and it had become a part of him. He left the dusty shelf, unable to bear the weight of all those forgotten promises. He moved to a new city, took a new name, but every night when he closes his eyes, he is back in that gallery. He is the curator, forever walking the halls of a museum built for murder, the calm, cultured voice of the artisan whispering in his ear. The story is over, but the exhibition in his mind will never close.